So, this is it, the final promised character for DST. It's been a long time coming, and to be honest, I'm quite excited to talk about Walter the Fearless and his perks and quirks. Walter is Don't Starve Together's latest and final survivor, making his way into the continent on the back of his noble steed, Woby. Before I talk about Walter's perks, I did want to discuss his personality and design. This is probably one of my favourite aspects of the character, and although Walter's nature as an upbeat child is definitely a contrast to Don't Starve's pre-existing cast of meagre, depressed adults, I think he fits into the game extremely well, for, admittedly, largely arbitrary reasons. For one, Walter seems to be a bit of a return to roots, in that he possesses some sort of a psychological fallacy, something that most Don't Starve Together characters have, some more serious than others, that have an underlying and ongoing effect on their personality, and in the best examples, their gameplay. For example, Wilson is egotistical despite his bumbling idiocy. Willow shows pyromantic tendencies, and is also childlike despite her age in her approach to many things. Wolfgang is cowardly despite his inhuman strength. Wendy is suicidal and wishes to join her sister in death. WX78 lacks empathy for living creatures and would rather see the majority of them destroyed, etc, etc. In more recent characters, the establishment of these psychological quirks has been increasingly less clever and less prominent than the other ones. For example, Wormwood and Word both share the quirk of more or less being stupid, which isn't particularly original nor endearing. Having Walter possess a relatively original psychological drawback, that being a worrying lack of fear to the point of insanity, is really clever. It's well integrated into his personality, and overall it makes him a comparatively strong character, especially when put next to other recents. He's nearly completely and utterly insane, and for that I enjoy his character and hold it in high regard. Even his position as a Boy Scout, although being much of a trope, is incredibly fitting for a survival scenario, and leads to some unique interactions throughout his stay in the Constant, as well as actually being related to his worrying lack of fear. And finally, Walter's contrast towards the other survivors by being a joyful child instead of a saddened adult. I don't know, it fits in a strange way. I can't really justify it, but it makes him fit and feel truly authentic in my opinion. Right off the bat, I just want to say that my biggest issue with Walter, hands down, is that he has a lot of unnecessary perks that don't contribute to a playstyle. In my eyes, what makes a DST character effective is a series of simple and concise perks that greatly impact the way you play the game. Because for me, that's what makes a character interesting and engaging in the long term, as opposed to one who can generally be described as Wilson except X. When I think about the effectiveness of a character, I'm generally going to rank them against this criteria, although of course, this is simply my opinion, and you're free to disagree. So basically, in accordance to this, Walter is not a well-made character. He has a lot of unnecessary perks that ultimately have little to no impact on how he's played, and can as such be described as Wilson with a slingshot, and a companion, and a tent, and a bunch of other stuff. The sheer volume of perks is the second thing that takes away from his potential in my eyes. Now, it's common, especially with Clay's newer works, to compare characters to something that someone from the community might have made, to a mod character, but in Walter's case I feel that this is more than justified, because just look at him. It's hard to divulge the original intent behind Walter's creation. What was he supposed to be? A ranged character seems like the most obvious choice, but then how come he has so many other perks that have nothing to do with ranged combat? Obviously there's the slingshot and the different ammo types, but beyond that, there's not much. Instead, we have what I like to call a perk soup, a concoction of mildly random perks that have no significance other than loosely relating to Walter's position as a scout. The plan for this video is to go over each perk one by one and discuss its significance, or lack thereof, in creating an overarching playstyle, and also simply its respective impact on gameplay. First up is the slingshot and ammo pellets. This perk of Walter's is what I believe to hold the most potential in terms of making a playstyle, because seeing a character for whom ranged combat is more viable than melee in most situations would honestly be a great solution for Walter's current blandness, but as it stands this isn't the case. On paper, the slingshot sounds powerful. 51 damage per shot with marble or cursed ammo is nothing to scoff at, right? But because of the slingshot's slow casting animation, which takes a total of 2 seconds, its DPS is halved to a measly 25.5, which is lower than a spear. That's right, the most basic weapon in the game outdamages Walter's slingshot, even when it's using the most expensive ammo. Marble is a somewhat difficult resource to renew. The only way to do so is through cultivating marble shrubs, which take near to a season to fully grow. Although each marble chunk makes 10 marble ammunition, it still takes a lot of trees to use marble pellets as a reliable source of damage. All that effort when you could instead use 1 flint, 3 grass, and 2 twigs. Highly mundane materials that you're likely to be carrying around anyway, and yet a higher damage per second. His other damage dealing ammo types are easier to renew, but with an even lower damage per second. Gold ammo with 7 DPS, and stone ammo with a pitiful 8.5. Of course, Walter can use these shot types to easily fell small creatures such as butterflies, birds, and rabbits, which can result in a semi-reliable source of meat. Although serving as a neat way to obtain some extra grub, this tool is by no way playstyle defining. This is definitely a personal thing, but I find melee weapons to be much more comfortable with their reliableness and also higher damage, to the point where I'm more than likely to neglect the slingshot almost entirely. Of course, there are some niche situations in which the slingshot might be useful, such as drawing aggro or kiting a boss risk-free, but such situations are few and far between, and are also guaranteed to take a painstakingly long time, due to the slingshot's low damage, as well as a lot of resources, irrespective of the ammo type being used. The support ammo types are also lacking. Slowdown rounds and poop pellets in particular are both fundamentally flawed. Don't Starve has always been a game where you can run away from just about everything, and doing so is usually better than risking getting hit by and during the cast animation, not to mention the former's expensive cost. Freeze rounds are also pretty mediocre. They cost 1 moon rock and 1 blue gem for 10, and although they have a higher freezing value than the ice staff, again, the slow animation gives them the same freeze per second at a higher cost, making them virtually pointless. And finally, curse rounds are also largely lacking. Their expensive cost of 1 Thursite fragment and 1 nightmare fuel for 10 rounds, in exchange for the same damage as marble shots and a 50% chance to spawn a tentacle that's gonna miss most of its attacks anyway. Yeah, they're not really worth it either, especially considering the commodity of melting marbles and frazzled wires, which can be traded for gold, as well as Thursite and nightmare fuel's better applications elsewhere. Walter's next major perk is Wobie, a strange canine creature who took a liking to him and accompanies him on his adventures throughout the Constant. Wobie will follow Walter at all times and is immortal, similar to critters crafted from the Rocky Den. Wobie has 9 inventory slots in normal form and can be fed monster foods to transform her into Big Wobie, who acts as a beefalo with the pudgy speed modifier. While riding Big Wobie, Walter's unable to use any weapons except the slingshot. Walter will buck Walter off if she gets hit, making her very impractical for combat. The main issues that I have with Wobie are mostly thematical. Her existence has virtually nothing to do with Walter's Boy Scouthood, and nor does she have much to contribute playstyle-wise. At this point it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but that's because I don't really have much else to say. Wobie isn't really original either. She's essentially a combination of follower-based character perks, of which we already have 2 characters based around, a Chester and a Beefalo. So, she's a bunch of pre-existing perks cooked into one. That feels synonymous with something. A certain Boy Scout I could name, perhaps. In exchange for these 2 main perks, Walter comes with the major drawback of losing sanity upon receiving damage. The amount he loses is the damage dealt after armor reduction is calculated multiplied by 2. For damage over time effects such as starvation, the sanity lost is directly proportionate to the health lost. Walter can halve this sanity loss by donning his Pine Tree Pioneer hat, one of which he starts with. More hats can be made with 4 silk. This downside makes getting hit as Walter extremely punishing. Even with the Pioneer hat equipped, staying sane in long fights that span over multiple days, such as raid bosses, can make maintaining sanity difficult and resource intensive, which equates to more time spent dealing with the shadow creatures and less time dealing with the boss itself. The intent behind this perk is probably to make Walter more reliant on his slingshot for dealing with these kind of situations, or to rely on other players in the server, which is meant to make him somewhat of a ranged support character, I guess. But this is only partially effective because, as I've said before, melee is still more viable in most situations, save for the rare raid boss, which, even then, takes an absurd amount of setup and time to execute. That's not to say that Walter is a terribly designed character. There are just a lot of things that don't quite add up to making him fulfilling and enjoyable, in my opinion. Walter has 2 further downsides that, akin to many of his positive attributes, are at least somewhat unnecessary from my viewpoint. The first is that Walter always takes 10 extra damage from bee mobs, including the almighty Bee Queen. This 10 extra damage ignores armor completely, although the bee's original damage can still be reduced by armor. Evidently the attempt here is to make a character building perk, but like a number of other perks designed the same way, there just isn't enough material here to justify it. I really could not care less about what compounds each character is allergic to. That concept is just so profoundly uninteresting to me, especially so as a thing that affects gameplay. Although, that being said, this perk's impact on gameplay is pretty minimal because you can just not get hit by bees. That just sounds like dumb advice, but most of the time you can easily avoid bee nests by not walking face first into them, or intentionally triggering them. This perk would definitely border on triviality if it weren't for the formidable Bee Queen boss, whose attacks count as bee damage, in addition to the swarms of grumble bees that she summons during the fight. However, due to the Bee Queen's considerable range, fast speed, and slowing honey, you're better off just using cheese methods to kill her, be it bunny hutches, slingshot cheese, or some other method, instead of risking decimation. Especially because most Bee Queen kills are probably caused by cheese methods such as these, this perk's impact on gameplay is not all too noticeable for the most part. Walter's second mini downside is that his sanity is no longer affected by most clothing items. This does not extend to equipment that involves shadow magic, such as the dark sword or shadow armor. I'm actually fairly fond of this perk. Obviously its effect isn't massively impactful, but it does make you rethink some choices in regards to clothing, i.e. the Tam O'Shanter. Look, it's sort of trivial, but hey, it's neat. And it actually fits Walter's character, highlighting his naivety and childishness. Beyond his downsides, Walter also has a large number of tiny positive attributes that have minute impacts on his gameplay. Some of them are simply there for flavor, such as the Glower Goop song and the campfire stories. Those perks in particular I don't really have a problem with because they're essentially there for character building and lore, similar to Winona's free hit from Charlie. Now, I suppose you could argue that all of Walter's mini perks are for story building, but the initial 2 perks that I mentioned are distinct from the rest in that they actually have dialogue, and actually add to his character in a unique way. Compare this to the perk in which Walter gains sanity from being around trees. Well, that's not clever character building. He likes being around trees, who fucking cares? Maybe I'm a bit biased, but I won't be treating the rest of his mini perks with that same excuse. The portable tent and the Pine Tree Pioneer hat are okay, because they have a relatively large impact on gameplay and don't push Walter's thematic consistency. The tent's a pretty nice way to restore health and sanity at the cost of hunger, especially considering its ridiculously cheap cost. As it only requires 15 grass and 4 sticks to make for 10 uses in terms of raw ingredients, it's a reliable way to top off any missing health or sanity. On a slightly related note, Walter has yet another insignificant side perk that halves his hunger loss while sleeping. This perk's impact on gameplay is so minimal, I didn't actually realise it even existed until scouring the wiki for tidbits while researching this video, and it isn't like I never used the tent roll or anything. Now, the main issue with these perks for me is not that they're directly harmful to Walter, he isn't better or worse off regarding their existence, it's just that they're so unnecessary. Obligatory callback to the mod character comparison from before. You'd think that even small character perks would be significant enough to be noticeable in-game, and that they wouldn't just slip under the radar like the sleeping hunger perk did for me. Or maybe I'm just an idiot, that's also a possibility, but still. Walter's faster fire cooking is another one that stuck out to me, not only for the above reasons, but to do with thematic consistency with other perks. Apparently having rudimentary survival training as a Boy Scout can give you powers that rival that of a firebending wizard. Look, maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion a bit, but it seems a bit weird to me that Walter's campfire skills rival that of Willow, someone who can literally control fire, and it's not like the other survivors wouldn't have learnt how to cook better during their time as, survivors. I'm starting to nitpick now, aren't I? God damn it, it feels like this character was designed to be nitpicked at sometimes. What with all the little perks that don't matter? Fine, whatever. On with the video, we're almost there. And finally, Walter also gains sanity around trees. This is probably the mini perk that bothers me the most, because it raises so many questions about the other survivors. He likes being around trees? Sure, so why doesn't Wilson get sanity from being around science-related structures? Why doesn't Wirt gain sanity in the swamp? Why doesn't Wendy feel at ease when in the graveyard? Hell, why doesn't Woody gain sanity from being around trees? He literally lived in the forest. Alright, that's it. I'm done with all these little yuck perks. It's time to move on to the final part of the video, where I'm going to review Walter as a whole, and chat about how he fits into DST, and also any changes I feel might improve him. Okay, I think throughout this video I might have been a bit too harsh on Walter. I do think he adds up to be a pretty good addition to the game. His character is well made, and he fits into the game, but his perks are almost good, just not quite. Overall, the main problem I have with him is that there's just too much going on. Far too many little tidbits that don't have much consequence. As I said earlier in the video, in my eyes, the strongest characters have perks that shape definitive playstyles, instead of less significant ones cobbled together erratically, which is sadly what Walter has. There is definitely potential here for a unique ranged character playstyle, which we've sort of seen before with Willa, but her playstyle was more of a hit and run type thing instead of a true ranger, so not really. In order for Walter to be a character for whom ranged combat is truly more viable than close quarters, he'll need a downside which will force him to rely upon shooting instead of stabbing, as well as new or reworked upsides in order to actually reward him for doing so. Lower melee damage seems like a super predictable choice for a downside, but I actually think it'll do just fine in making Walter more dependent on ranged combat. Making him crippled in melee combat in some other way could also work, such as a slower attack speed. In compensation for this, his slingshot abilities would have to be made much more potent. This could likely be achieved with some simple number adjustments, such as different resource costs and crafting payouts, or just higher damage. Additionally, the utility ammo types could definitely do with some major changes involving crafting costs and ability, because as of now they are absolutely not worth making in most scenarios. And finally, trim the fat. Get rid of the unnecessary perks. I know it sounds brutal, but then again, they removed Warbucks, so don't worry, that's just a joke. Well, it's also not. They did remove an entire character. I'm sure a couple of meaningless perks are well within the realm of possibility. Anyway, thank you so much for watching the whole video up until this point. In this video I tried something a bit different structure-wise, which was basically to spend less time talking about the nitty-gritty stat side of things, and spend more time analysing and talking about my thoughts on the character. I enjoyed making the video more. I think it gives me more time to talk about the important stuff, and less time going over the less interesting details, and hopefully it's more enjoyable to watch as well. This video ended up surprisingly lengthy considering that, which I think proves the new format's effectiveness, as there was less time spent regurgitating raw information and stats, which allowed me to spend more time on the analysis side. And of course, the Ranch Sona style character stills are probably the biggest new thing in this video. Basically, I felt there was a lot of periods in the previous videos with not much going on, because sometimes, especially with the more opinionated segments, it's kinda tricky to find background footage that fits in with what I'm saying and isn't too distracting, so, hopefully this works as a fill-in for that kind of thing, although I do want to avoid it taking away from my editing quality by being too overused, or something like that. Any feedback on these two things would be greatly appreciated, also the video itself, that too. As per usual, especially with videos like these, I always read every comment posted, so get typing. Anyway, thanks for sitting through this whole thing, wash those filthy paws of yours, and I guess I'll see you next time.